Well, economic sanctions against Russia are starting to have an impact. The Russian ruble has plunged to a record low, dropping more than 30% against the US dollar. Russians are scrambling to withdraw money from banks, with long queues forming at cash machines across the country. In an attempt to prop up the ruble, Russia's central bank doubled its key interest rate to an unprecedented 20% and ordered domestic export companies to sell foreign reserves. Sanctions imposed by the US and Europe have also largely cut off the country from the global financial system.
European stock markets fell steeply as the financial sector reacted to the latest sanctions. Among those, major Russian banks would be kicked out of the global financial transaction network SWIFT at a cost not only to Russia but also to its trading partners. Over the weekend, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz made it clear that things could get even worse. Let's not kid ourselves. Putin will not change his course overnight. But very soon, the Russian leadership will feel the high price it is paying. Already in the last week, the Russian stock market sank by more than 30%. That shows our sanctions are working and we reserve the right to impose further sanctions. So far, sanctions against Russia include the exclusion from SWIFT, making it impossible for sanctioned Russian banks to pay for and receive goods from abroad. There are also restrictions on major banks with immediate consequences. The European subsidiary of Russia's state-owned Sberbank is facing bankruptcy. Last week's initial sanctions also included asset freezes and travel bans for individuals, as well as the blocking of Russia's access to semiconductors, computers and other high-tech products. Experts consider the sanctions against Russia harsh and expect them to possibly cripple the Russian economy for years to come.
Joining me now in the studio is DW correspondent Clifford Kuhne. Clifford, let's talk about the implication these sanctions are having. The ruble is plummeting, first of all. What does that mean for the Russian economy?
Well, it's a disaster in many ways. The pictures we've just seen of these queues outside banks tell us so much. If you imagine that you're a Russian saver, an ordinary Russian who's got all their savings in rubles, they're worth 30% less today than they were yesterday. It's 119 rubles to the dollar now. So in that case, it's a very, very serious problem. And, often when we're talking about, the political and the economic where they overlap, I think it's always with sort of things like currency values that you really see the political impact, the possible political impact of this because it's so strong. Prices will rise because it will force inflation, because a lot of the economy relies on imports, which will now cost more because the ruble is worth less. So in these areas, you can sort of see that it's going to have massive impact.
The sanctions on the Russian central bank, is that sort of the sharpest weapon that has been employed?
It is. I mean, there's been quite a lot of discussion about the SWIFT transfer payments system being a strong weapon, but actually in many ways the limitation and the restrictions on the European Central Bank are even tougher, because what it means is that Russia has something like 630 billion in foreign reserves, which in the run-up to the invasion was sort of seen as the war chest that Putin would use for this. But around 40% of those are held overseas. And if they can't access 40% of their reserves, that puts them into a difficult position. So the restrictions on the central banks have been a very important weapon.
Another important weapon is, of course, the exclusion from this SWIFT banking payment and information system that's used globally. In which way does that affect the Russian economy?
Yeah, well, I think the SWIFT system is kind of like a WhatsApp where banks talk to each other on a social. It's a communications tool, essentially. So while in many ways it isn't as sharp a weapon as the the Russian central bank sanctions, it's still a very important one because banks can't talk to each other, which means you can't do clearing. You have to use alternative systems, and that takes time and it costs money. And some people have estimated it could cost maybe 20% more in terms of transaction costs. So it's also something that will completely isolate the Russian banking system, because so many countries are now sanctioning the Russian banking system that nobody's going to really bother putting in an alternative system of payments.
So Russian foreign trade, at least with the West, really has come more or less to a standstill. Now, many people have suggested suggested that China might be able to help Russia out and buy more gas or oil from Russia. A, is that likely? B, is China willing to do that?
Well, I think China must be watching this with a certain amount of horror, actually. Early in February, they signed a pact, the new era. They were talking about the close friendship. And then suddenly the invasion happened. There's a lot of questions about whether China knew it was going to happen. It's very possible they did. But the fallout from the invasion is certainly something that they're going to be aware of. And the question is whether China is prepared to allow itself, by association, to be also guilty, and whether it's prepared to make that sacrifice for its friends in Russia. And I think myself that it's very unlikely to do that, because China is much more interconnected in global trade. Also, China has a lot more power and a lot more economic muscle than Russia. So I think if it becomes a difficult situation for China to back up Russia, as increasingly looks likely, I think they're probably going to hold back.
Is China in any way dependent on Russia?
Well, China needs the energy, like everyone else. In Europe, it seems, and in that whole landmass, and that's a big aspect. A lot of the relationship is political, and they do have close trading links, and traditionally have had close trading links. But I think China is in a much better position to stand alone if it needs to. I think Russia needs China more than China needs Russia.
Clifford Cullen there. Thank you very much for this assessment. And as we heard, a part of their sanctions against Russia, the European Union and its allies have agreed to block some Russian banks from the SWIFT global payment system. The move is widely regarded as the toughest measure in trying to put pressure on the Russian economy. Here's why.
What is SWIFT? The acronym stands for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, a global network founded to process international financial transactions. It's been around since 1973. 190 countries use the standardized system, as well as banks and commodities and securities traders. Last year, some 42 million transactions were handled by SWIFT every day. Each SWIFT member is identified by its bank identifier code, or BIC. The BIC ensures that money transfers are paid into the correct account. A BIC is familiar to anyone with a bank card. It allows Bank A in Germany to carry out transactions with money, shares or precious metals with Bank B in the US. If a BIC code is blocked, the member is shut out of SWIFT. Barring Russia's access to the SWIFT network would sever the country completely from the international monetary flow. Russia's companies would no longer be able to pay for or receive foreign goods. Russia's trade with the rest of the world would be suspended. But it means the trade in urgently needed goods from Russia would also be interrupted. The result, rising energy prices worldwide. And Russia is not only a major exporter of oil and gas, but of iron and steel too. Still, being shut out of SWIFT would harm Russia most of all. In the catalogue of sanctions, it's the instrument that cuts the deepest.
A pipeline for transporting gas from Poland to Lithuania is expected to be completed ahead of schedule. Operator Gas Systems says it will open May 1st instead of later in the year, as initially announced. Auctions for capacity allocation will begin in April. Work has been stepped up amid concerns about European energy security. Now, it's normally one of the biggest events of the year for technology fans. The Mobile World Congress starts in Barcelona. Up to 60,000 trade visitors are expected at the world's largest mobile communications trade fair. But it's also been overshadowed by the events in Ukraine. And the massive economic sanctions on Russia include something not seen in decades: a ban on technology transfers. High-tech companies at the fair are discussing what that could mean for them. DW's Chelsea Delaney is at the MWC in Barcelona. She sent us this assessment.
Well, this was expected to be a week of celebration for the global technology industry, a return to normality after the pandemic. Instead, the war between Russia and Ukraine is really dominating this event. There was supposed to be a Russia pavilion. There no longer will be. But there's also a lot of long-term consequences for the industry that we're going to see really taking center stage here. First and foremost, Russia's access to Western technology, particularly semiconductors, is going to be restricted as well. Russia is a major supplier of things like palladium or neon that are crucial to technology production. So this could end up actually worsening some of these supply chain issues we've been dealing with. At the same time, a lot of Western companies like Google or Facebook or Twitter, YouTube are seeing access to their services restricted in Russia or are restricting them themselves. So they're having to acknowledge that their products are being used as a weapon, as the Ukrainian deputy prime minister said, that they're being used for propaganda, to build influence, for censorship. So this is really a landmark moment in which global technology giants have to really face their role in geopolitical events. And the outcome of that, analysts say, is what they're calling the splinter net, where we see access to technology, access to the internet become really fractured and no longer this global connector that we've known it as.